Good evening. My name is Isabelle Teare with the WTJX Newsfeed, and this is Trial Watch. This was the third day, if you include jury selection, of the state of Florida versus Stephen Payne Sr. I'm up here in Jacksonville, Duval County, covering this case. And today, the jury came back with a verdict and found Payne guilty of this one count of sexual battery. Now, before we get into what happened in the courtroom, the reactions, and all of that, I want to just explain everything that happened today that led up to this guilty verdict. So let's dive into that. This morning, the court started by the defense and Payne's defense attorneys telling the judge that Payne would not testify on his behalf. This was something that was up in the air yesterday, but that was their decision. And then the defense rested their case. So after that, it was now time for the judge and the attorneys to do something called a charging conference. This is done outside the presence of the jury. And this is where the judge and the attorneys meet to finalize instructions that they're going to give to the jury right before the jury goes in to deliberate and make their decision. This was a relatively quick conference. And after that, the jury was brought back into the courtroom, and it was time for closing arguments. The prosecution started. Prosecutor Shayna Ruth led the closing arguments for the state of Florida. And she started off by looking at the jury and saying that the truth always comes out. She then told them that to find Stephen Payne guilty, there were three elements that had to be met. The first was sexual battery, that there was penetration of the vagina by an object. The second was that the victim was between 12 and 18 years old. And the third was that at the time, the defendant was in a familial or custodial role over that victim. So the prosecution says that those second and third elements aren't in dispute. She was in that age range, and he was in a custodial role over her. She then moved in to just talking to the jury more generally. She said that children look at things differently. She said they move through the world differently, and that children rely on the adults in their life to guide them through this world. She said that Payne took advantage of that he exploited Steffi that he had complete control over her, and that he abused that control when he committed this crime, when he forced that object inside of her. Sorry, just looking down at my notes quickly to make sure I don't miss anything here. She also then went into talking about how Steffi wasn't getting anything for her testimony today. She said that her citizenship, any kind of visa, did not rest on the outcome of this trial. And then she went on to talking about her mother, Teresa Emelian. She said Teresa was desperate for her child to have a better life, and that was why she trusted Payne, this member of the police department, this officer who she thought was going to take care of her daughter. She said that Steffi's mother was powerless in this situation. She was living in St. Lucia. She didn't have control, and that she couldn't do anything. So that's why all of this unfolded as it did. She then went and started talking and poking holes or trying to in the testimony of the witnesses that the defense called. This was Noelise Powell and Lauren Harris. The prosecution said Noelise Powell, quote, told you falsehood after falsehood after falsehood on the stand. She said that when Noelise Powell said it was her idea for Steffi to come live with her on St. John, that was false. She said that when Noelise Powell told everyone that she coordinated for Steffi to move to Florida, that was false. And she said that the fact that she was saying all of these falsehoods should tell the jury that Noelise Powell knows nothing about the crime that was committed. She then spoke about Lauren Harris's testimony, and she said that Lauren Harris was either intentionally telling falsehoods or she was just wrong. And what she really hammered on was that detail about the day of the crime. The day that Steffi says this happened was the day after Stephen Payne brought her to Jacksonville. She said that everyone was out of the house because they were at work and Stephen Payne Jr. was at school. And so her and Payne were alone. When Lauren Harris testified, you might remember from yesterday, she said that wasn't true. It was a Monday and that they had spent the entire day trying to get Steffi enrolled in school. They were all together. So what the prosecution did in their closing was make sure to point out again to the jury that while Harris had said it was a Monday, it was actually a Wednesday that Steffi was enrolled in school, according to the school's enrollment documents. She then talked about why Steffi didn't speak up to Lauren Harris or Noah Lease, and she said, look at what their testimony said. It's obvious that these two women wouldn't have helped her. They were Stephen Payne's fiercest advocates, and we saw that today. She also said that Stephen Payne knew that these women were his advocates and that he used that to exploit Steffi. He used that to his benefit. She then discussed patterns in Payne's behavior, patterns with Chesney Jones and Steffi. She said that Payne started with both of them by having them grow to trust him in group settings. Both of them were in a band together. Both of them knew him through the Julia Sprouse School. She said his next move was to then test both of them. And for Chesney, the test was this thing with the push-ups. For Steffi, this test was kissing her in the band room and then the massage in the shower in the hotel. She said that Payne, after he tested them, he then took action. And this is where those assaults happened. The water incident at the beach for Chesney and the sex toy, the vibrator that was inserted into Steffi. So once again, showing that there was this pattern of behavior and how he went about moving. She closed out her arguments by looking at the jury and saying, if you believe Steffi, who has nothing to gain, that is enough for you to find Payne guilty. And again, she has nothing to gain by giving this testimony in terms of a visa or anything like that. Next, it was time for the defense to give their closing. The defense attorney, Christopher Carson, who represents Payne, did the closing argument. And he opened up by telling the jury that he had fear. He harbored fear about these cases because of the emotional impact of the subject matter and how that can sometimes distract from the facts of the case. He told the jury that emotions can be blinding, that it's difficult to set them aside, but he said that an emotional decision is a poor decision. He then told the jury that Steffi's accusations were a product of her emotions and that the allegations she made simply were not supported by what had been presented during the trial. And he told the jury that they had to base their verdict on the evidence in the trial and the evidence alone. He then went and started doing his own poking holes in the testimony of the witnesses called by the prosecution. He said that Steffi and her mother were close, that Steffi would have had ample opportunity to tell her. And he also said that while the state said Steffi's mother was powerless, he said no, Steffi's mother did have power. She came to visit Steffi multiple times. She spoke with Steffi often, and she could have called the cops. She could have gotten help, but she didn't. And Steffi never reported this to her. He then went on to explain to the jury, he was saying that Steffi made these allegations because of anger and emotion and wanting to get back to the United States. He said that when Steffi returned to St. Lucia, her world was flipped on its head because she was back to living in, quote, abject poverty. And she wanted the opportunity to return to the United States. But when the defendant was no longer communicating with her or returning her calls, she was angry. And he said that's when those allegations came out, or that's why they came out. He then moved on to talking about what we didn't hear in this case. And what he says was that we didn't hear any real evidence that corroborated her words. He said all we had were her words. He then said that people can say anything, but he told the jury that it was their job to weigh the credibility of what people say, but that they had no evidence to help them corroborate. In other cases, you would listen to a witness, and then there might be a supporting document, DNA, some kind of physical evidence to help corroborate what they were saying. But he said in this case, there was, quote, a glaring lack of corroboration. He then talked about how there was no sex toy ever located. He talked about the contradiction about that photo that was discussed yesterday, the mirror selfie in that hotel room. He said that showed that Steffi wasn't telling the truth because the furniture wasn't in the same area, or maybe didn't exist like she said it did. He then moved on to talking about these text messages that we heard about yesterday between Steffi and Lauren Harris, Auntie Lori. And he said that these text messages showed that Steffi was realizing that she wasn't going to get what she wanted. She wasn't going to get the money or get back to the United States. So she, quote, lashed out. He then discussed the U visa. And this is an important note because it comes up later on during jury deliberation. He asked the jury if they knew what a U visa was. And he explained that a U visa was something that permits someone to remain in the United States if they are a victim of a certain qualifying crime. Now, remember yesterday we talked about how there was some back and forth testimony about whether or not Steffi ever got this U visa. She has not gotten it, but there was discussion that maybe there had been an application or something in the works. Anyway, he said that one of the qualifying crimes for this U visa was sexual battery. And he basically was then implying that this is why she was making these claims. He then moved on to the testimony of Detective Ward. And this was the detective who yesterday I said his testimony was kind of evasive. He wasn't really answering questions. And the defense was very blunt in how they portrayed his testimony. They said, we didn't learn much from Detective Ward. They said that his investigation was, quote, mailed in, and that when they spent time questioning him yesterday, they spent more time talking about what he didn't do than what he did do. When he talked about Chesney Jones' testimony, he told the jury that her story didn't make any sense. He said Payne was a public figure, a very recognized person in the Virgin Islands, and that Chesney Jones was trying to say that this public figure took her to a beach on St. John. He said beaches on St. John were some of the most popular in the world because of their beauty. They were full of tourists. And so Chesney saying that this well-known figure took her to a beach that would have been very populated with tourists and then had her strip and then assaulted her, he said, that doesn't make any sense, does it? That's what he was saying to the jury. He also said that Chesney's testimony and Steffi's testimony, he said they weren't factually related. He said that he thought the only reason Chesney was here was because the prosecution was trying to, quote, dress up a case that doesn't have corroborative evidence. He then moved on to talking about the witnesses that the defense called. This is Noelise Powell, the girlfriend, and Lauren Harris, the sister. He said that neither Noelise Powell nor Lauren Harris ever got a whiff or a sense that something was wrong or had happened between Steffi and Payne. He drilled down again that it was Noelise's idea for her to live with her in St. John, for her to go to Florida, that Noah Lease was the one who did this illegal paperwork to get her from St. Thomas to Florida. And then he talked about something personal between Noah Lease and Payne. He said that the fact that Noah Lease Powell had stuck around with Payne throughout all of this showed her credibility and his credibility, showed her credibility of her belief of Payne's innocence. So he said that she could have just jumped ship on this relationship. But the fact that she was here today, that was important. He said that for Lauren Harris, it was clear that Steffi viewed both Harris and Powell as these surrogate mothers, and yet she never disclosed any allegations about what happened. He closed his arguments by looking at the jury and saying that if they had a singular doubt in their minds, and if that doubt was reasonable, then their verdict legally had to be not guilty. He told them that these types of verdicts take courage, but that the jury had to set aside their feelings and objectively look at the evidence in this case. Now, the United States after this was able to get up and do a rebuttal. The rebuttal was quick. It was led by attorney Jacqueline Blair for the prosecution. And she said to the jury that, the defense is saying that Steffi made up this story. But she said, why, if Steffi was just trying to make up a story because she was angry, why would she make up such a bizarre story with so many detailed facts? She even looked at the jury and said, if Steffi was trying to make up a story, rape would have been an easier story to remember over all of these years. But instead, that's not what Steffi's testimony was. Steffi had this very detailed, bizarre story of multiple incidents. She said that Steffi was a young girl. She was scared, and that's why she didn't report this to these people. She was living with the relatives of Payne. She said, of course, she wouldn't report it to them. And then she got to probably the most important point of this rebuttal. She looked at the jury and she said to them that testimony is evidence. We've heard so much in this case about the lack of physical evidence. However, she said that what you heard on the stand on the stand yesterday, that was evidence. She also said that Chesney Jones's testimony, that was also a bizarre story, that why would she have made that up? And that Chesney Jones showed a common scheme and that this was a plan, not a mistake. This was something that he knew he was doing and that he was in a position of power over both Chesney and Steffi. And let me just make sure I'm not missing anything here. So she ended by just looking at the jury and saying that both Steffi and Chesney had been credible over multiple years. Their stories hadn't changed. And that what was told on the stands, that was what happened to them. And that was the evidence that the jury needed to use. And that was the end of closing arguments. So now the jury has heard everything that they are going to hear from witnesses, from attorneys, and it was now time for the judge to give them their jury instructions. Now, at this point, it's an important side note to talk a little bit about the jury pool. So initially, you'll remember that I told you there were 8 jurors that were selected for this case, but 2 of those jurors were alternates. And none of the jurors know if they're alternates or not. The reason they have alternates is in case something happens, that person can step in and not miss a beat. And the reason they're not told if they're alternates is because they want everyone to basically be paying attention the whole time. So the judge dismissed 2 of the jurors, which left us with a jury pool of 6 people. This was 3 men and 3 women. And it was a young jury pool. One of the men looked to be in his 50s, but the remaining 5 jurors looked like they were in their 30s. So a very young group of people, from what I could tell. So the judge then gave these instructions to these 6 jurors. And what she said was that for a guilty verdict to be reached, the 3 elements had to be met. These are the 3 elements that the prosecution discussed in their opening statements. The fact that, 1, there was engaged in this act, the penetration of the vagina by an object. 2nd, this age range between 12 and 18. 3rd, position of familial or custodial role. But she added a little bit to that, saying that they had to, meet these and believe these beyond a reasonable doubt. She said that reasonable doubt might arise from evidence, it might arise from a lack of evidence, or it might arise from a conflict in evidence. But she ultimately just told the jury to use their common sense. She also told them that they were not allowed to use the fact that Payne didn't testify as a determining factor in their verdict. And she also told them that the case couldn't be decided because they felt bad for someone or because they were angry for someone. It couldn't be decided by emotion. It had to be decided based on evidence and fact. So then the jury was dismissed to deliberate, and court was in recess. They were dismissed at 12:20, and then less than an hour later at 1:10, everyone was called back into the courtroom because the jury had a question. And that question was, will the verdict in this case influence Steffi Emelian's eligibility for a U visa? That's that document we've been talking about. That could give her citizenship. Now, there was some discussion about whether or not, or how they were going to respond to this question, the words they were going to use, but they ultimately came up with this, and this is what they sent back to the jury. Quote, "You must base your verdict only in the law on which I instructed you and the evidence presented in court." They sent that back to the jury, and then it was back to waiting for them to come back with a verdict. Court was then in recess. But then at 3:20, so this is 3 hours that the jury's been deliberating, we were told that they'd come to their final verdict, and everyone was called into the courtroom. So just to give you an idea of what was going on in the courtroom at the time, we had on the side I was sitting on the left, behind where the prosecution sits, we had Steffi Emelian. She was sitting up there, as well as her mother, Teresa Emelian, and then Danae DeSuy, who is this former staffer of Stephen Payne's, who's accused him of things involving an incident in February of 2022. She has a case pending in the Virgin Islands, but we didn't hear anything about her case during this trial. But her lawyer told me that she was here to support Steffi. And then there was also a victim advocate sitting up there. On the other side of the courtroom, sitting behind Stephen Payne, was Payne's mother, who has been here throughout the trial, his brother, Clarence Payne. But then what was different today is that Lauren Harris, his sister, and his girlfriend, Miss Powell, they were sitting in the gallery today. Yesterday, they were witnesses, so they weren't. But today, they were just there as family members to support Stephen Payne. Then, as the jury was being brought in, and we were waiting for that verdict slip to be passed, Lauren Harris, Stephen Payne's sister, really looked like she was close to tears while waiting for this. But the attitude, the feeling in the room, it was solemn. It was a somber atmosphere. And then the jury, the slip was passed over, and the verdict was read out as guilty on this one count of sexual battery. And immediately, Stephen Payne's sister, Lauren Harris, bent over on that bench and started crying. Stephen Payne's mother was also crying, but softly. But Payne himself, he was non-reactive from what I could see. I didn't see his body move in any way. I didn't see any facial expressions. He just looked on as the verdict was read. Steffi Emilian was sitting right in front of me. I could see the side of her face, but she also was non-reactive. I didn't see any of the people in that witness bench show any real emotion or reaction to this. After the verdict was read, the police officers in the courtroom took Payne and had him sit down and remove certain items from his pockets. And then they placed him in handcuffs and they took him out of the courtroom. They took him to jail where he will now await sentencing. And everyone was then escorted out of the courtroom. So now at this point, he has been found guilty, but we're not sure about what this sentence will be. After we were outside the courtroom, I did talk with his defense attorneys a little bit, and we right now do not have a date set for sentencing, but we're thinking sometime in early November. When it comes to the amount of time Stephen Payne is, looking at potentially facing in prison, that also is very unclear right now. But what I can tell you is what the attorneys told me, and that's that this sexual battery charge is something called an F1 PBL, and that stands for a first-degree felony punishable by life. So that means that sexual battery, it's not only a first-degree felony, which could call for 30 years in prison, it also has this punishable by life element, meaning he could be sentenced to life in prison for this sexual battery. I asked if this was something that was realistic, that could he be spending this much time, this behind bars, this kind of the ultimate prison sentence. And they said that they really couldn't give me an answer. They called it a complex math equation that would happen at sentencing. There would be different guidelines, different points considered, and all of this. So unfortunately, I really can't give you any kind of idea about the amount of time that Payne is facing now that he's been found guilty. What I can tell you is that after the verdict and after leaving the courthouse, I did get in touch with Steffi Emilian, the victim at the center of this case. And we had a brief interview talking about, her feelings on this verdict. So I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit of that discussion. So Steffi, when I asked her how she felt hearing this guilty verdict, she said that it felt immediately like this weight had been lifted off of her shoulders. She said that this has been a long time coming. This has been years of waiting for the trial and different postponements and things like that. And when I asked her about, what she maybe wanted people to know about why she did this or why she came forward in her testimony, she said that this wasn't just about her. She said that this was for all of the other women that Payne has perhaps impacted throughout his life, and for all of the women who couldn't testify or maybe were scared to come forward and testify. She said she hoped that this would make those other women feel brave and empowered. I then asked her how she felt while she was sitting there awaiting this verdict, because she was sitting in front of me, and I said, I couldn't get any read on how you were feeling. She said she was incredibly nervous while she was sitting there and waiting, and she actually told me that her legs were shaking. But she said that her and her mother had spent a lot of time this week praying about this verdict, and she said they had spent a significant amount of time this morning praying on the topic. I then asked her about, what was next following this verdict. And she said that this was something that was going to impact her for her entire life, she thought. But she said that now that this verdict had been reached, now that he had been found guilty, she felt like she could really begin a healing process. And she said that other victims would be able to do that now too, she hoped. And when I asked exactly what was up next for her in terms of where she was going, she said that her and her mother would be returning home and back to their normal lives. She said she just wanted to live a good life and be a person that, gave back to her family. And that was the end of our conversation. I thanked her for, taking the time to speak with me. And I believe you'll be able to hear more about that interview on tomorrow's news. But this is the end of Trial Watch for this case, the state of Florida versus Stephen Payne Sr. It started on Monday. Today is Wednesday. The verdict was reached, and we're now awaiting sentencing. So once we have that information, we'll be sure to update you. Thank you for following along. Once again, my name is Isabelle Teare with the WTJX Newsfeed, and this is Trial Watch. Have a good evening.